So welcome. Our session today is Will They Fund It? Pitching an OER project to your VP of Finance. My name is Dan Arch. I'm the Dean of Clark Library at University of Portland. And this is Adam Murray, the Dean of Libraries and Educational Technologies at James Madison. So he's going to start us off and talk about how we designed the study we're doing and some of our plans for it.
Hi. Thanks for coming this afternoon. So the purpose of this presentation is to share with you some preliminary findings from a qualitative study that is meant to document the potential barriers to OER projects as seen by vice presidents of finance and administration at public and private not-for-profit institutions in the United States. This is a qualitative study, so we're going to be talking about qualitative data that we've gathered through interviews. We selected vice presidents, VPFAs, vice presidents of finance and administration, for this study because their support of projects like OER projects is essential for their success. At many institutions, the provost is often kind of seen as the second in command following the president of the university. However, the provost usually has to work very closely with the VPFA in order to fund the different projects taking place within academic affairs. VPFAs are usually the chief financial officers for our institutions, and so they are in control of the accounts where tuition money flows into and where state dollars flow into if you're a public university. And they usually face a lot of political pressure from many different stakeholder groups around the concept of keeping the cost of college low and thereby keeping potential tuition increases from going up higher than they already do. So they experience a lot of political pressures that even provosts aren't necessarily exposed to, and certainly librarians aren't. And so they offer a very different perspective on different initiatives that the library might undertake, including an OER program. We chose to do this as a qualitative study because there is quite literally no existing literature about this type of topic. VPFAs have their own national associations, just as we do. Their websites and their publications have very little to do with textbook costs. It's usually associated with the overall topic of cost of college, cost to attend college, and next to nothing about OER. So there's very little awareness in the national associations for VPFAs on OER. And within our own literature about OER, very little looking at the perceptions of senior administration within colleges and universities about the effectiveness, the impact, the value of having an OER program. So it's a qualitative study because we quite literally didn't know what to ask. We were planning, and we are planning, and this is getting into the next steps, to conduct a nationwide survey of VPFAs on their perceptions of OER programs, but because we had no idea quite what to ask, we weren't able to ground that in the literature. We felt that we needed to do a qualitative study first with a very small sample in order to get a better idea of their perceptions. So along those lines, because it is qualitative data, we will be applying a coding structure to the data that we've gathered through our interviews. And we're very much interested in providing you guys an opportunity to look at our coding structure and to provide feedback to us on methods of analysis that you might find useful as we go through our data and begin to write it up. So if you would like to, we have copies of the coding structure up here after the presentation. You're welcome to come up and take a look at it and leave us some feedback. The qualitative study had three distinct research questions, which you can see up here. Which institutional or administrative factors impact positively or negatively the implementation or production of OER materials? Which of the potential benefits of OER would help justify or offset the costs of implementing an OER program or of producing OER materials? And three, what financial solutions within the university would VPFAs be willing to explore to help cover the cost of implementing an OER program? I see somebody taking a picture, so I'll hold on just a second. Awesome. So very quickly going over our methodology, as I mentioned, since there is no existing literature to pull from, this is very much so an exploratory study. We are intending to pull the data, the findings from this, and use it as a method to construct a survey that we'll be putting out more nationwide and more comprehensively. We're using an ethnographic approach for this study. Ethnography is an approach, qualitative methodology that tends to is used for looking at similarities within a culture. So we're using this method because while VPFAs, there's one per university, and they're at different universities, the fact that they share similar positions and similar responsibilities mean that, like librarians nationally, they have a culture that they share across institutions. So we're using an ethnographic approach to capture that. We're using a maximum variation sampling procedure. This is a purposeful sampling technique that allows us to align a small sample with the national numbers for Carnegie classification and institutional control. So you'll see here a chart that outlines both public and private, and then research very intensive, research intensive, DRU, master's large, master's medium, and master's small institutions on the right. And on the left are the numbers of institutions that we chose from these subsets. We were able to put together a small pool, 10 institutions, and to designate out a sample of either 1 or 2 per type of institution. And by doing this, we were able to actually match the ratio of our pool to the overall ratio of institutions nationally. So we're getting some validity to the data by doing that. We used a random number generator to randomly select institutions within the pools. And then from there, we eliminated any institutions where they already had an existing OER program. We piloted our interview with our own VPs of Finance and Administration in order to practice giving the interview in the first place, and then also to get their feedback about whether the questions made sense to them. And we incorporated some of their feedback into our final questions before we launched the interview process. Among those was changing the language of OER to a zero-cost textbook program, something that these administrators found a little bit more of an accessible term for them. We had quite a few challenges scheduling these interviews. As you can imagine, these are very busy individuals for the different institutions that they work for. So far we have completed 7 of the 10, and we're hoping to be able to complete the other 3 very, very soon. An interesting finding that we're going to note when we do write this up is that many times we would be diverted to the bookstore to participate in this interview. And we had to spend a little bit of extra time working with the admin assistants and sometimes with the VPFAs themselves in assuring them that we did indeed want their perceptions, regardless of the fact that they felt they didn't know enough to be able to answer the questions. So that was a very interesting finding in and of itself. Once they agreed to participate, we sent the questions and informed consent documentation in advance so that they could prepare for the interview. And the interviews tended to last 15 minutes or less, usually around 10. We conducted them via WebEx, and again, an interesting finding is the difficulty in getting our VPs of finance accurately able to use WebEx. I'll turn it over now to Zan, who will start to share some of our preliminary observations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go through the interview questions now and talk about first why we felt these were important questions to ask, and some of the results we got, and some of the ways we think that might lead to takeaways for you, and hopefully when we have a larger set of data to work with. So our first 2 questions really to try to figure out what kinds of information the VPFAs were hearing from both external and internal stakeholders. So how aware they were that there was an issue with textbook costs. Surprisingly, most interviewees had not heard concerns from either external or internal stakeholders. If anything, there have been a few internal discussions, but very little from externals. What we really thought would happen was we would have board members or donors hearing things in the Chronicle of Higher Ed and coming to the administration and saying we have a problem to address, and we didn't find that information was filtering to VPFAs. And that may mean that in approaching administrators like a VPFA, they may be completely unaware that this is a problem to solve. And for those who had heard concerns, what they were looking at to address these concerns were often third-party programs. So they weren't looking to say, oh, is a library going to figure out a program to address this? They were trying to think usually, often of the bookstore. Is there a rental program through the bookstore that can address this? Is there a more robust used book program? So they were thinking about who they could bring in to solve this for them, not what kinds of efforts the university could make itself. Next, we want to understand how aware they were of OERs. So we have language here that was developed by the Babson Survey Research Group and tested for validity. And again, we sent this in advance, and we were screen sharing during the interviews to have allow them to review this language. And this was split fairly evenly in the interviews. We did. Some had heard of OERs and many have not. Again, this speaks to, we are so used to hearing about these types of concerns in our professional literature, in the articles and blogs we read. Often these people had no idea what we were talking about. So in approaching them with a program, an OER program, they may need a lot of that background first. One of the things I found interesting as well is we had committed to a 10 to 15 minute interview. These were very busy people. And in doing that, we often were not really able to meet an educational need that came up in this process. So I have a few quotes which are always interesting. One asked, "I guess I have a sense of what they are. My questions or the gap in my knowledge is, where do I go to find them? Do they exist in our libraries or other places?" Really not clear on the whole concept, but we weren't really able to help during this process, even meet the educational need. We've been trying to follow up as much as possible, but it's said to me that these were interested and engaged administrators, but we weren't able to necessarily do that background work as part of the interview process. Next, we were listing out some expenditures and benefits for programs like this, with the idea of trying to figure out what would be a compelling justification. So if a library was going to approach administrator with a proposal, what would they find the most compelling as a justification to spend institutional funds? Most found the benefits convincing, but really focused on the total cost of attending college. So the total cost of attendance really was the most influential point we found with administrators. On the other hand, I have a couple quotes from. We had one research university which was wonderful because they were really against the whole idea, which I thought was, again, coming from our professional literature and the information we exchange with each other, we think this is an unalloyed good. This is something we would want to try for. And we had one person who was just not down for this. And so it was a very good perspective to bring in, because he was also very eloquent in his dislike of the idea. So in this case, he said, "None of these, in my view, rise to the proof that would be needed for me to want to prioritize institutional dollars." So in this case, it wasn't necessarily even that these benefits weren't convincing enough, but how does a program like this get prioritized against other programs coming from the university? Just because it may be a good, it has to still fight it out with other priorities for the university. Next, we want to know, are there other potential benefits that might be convincing to your administration that you could think of, and what barriers may exist? And the two benefits that came up, some people didn't have an answer for this, but two benefits I thought were really interesting that came up. First was the ready availability of open textbooks and students having the right version on the first day of class. Something that I think that we are aware of as an issue, but was not part of our original list, and also a valuable point. Some really realized that versioning problem with the textbook market, and the better availability of something that could be an OER or a non-traditional textbook. We also heard it could increase the brand recognition, make the university more competitive, which make it more attractive and give us a better pool to recruit from. Another benefit that I hadn't anticipated in our discussions, a quote from one of them said, "So if I could be convinced that we would see a material, measurable, and valuable improvement in our attractiveness to applicants and the matriculation of admitted students to actually starting at the university based on a factor related to a zero cost for student textbook program, that would certainly give it some attention." So that additional potential benefit of a selling point for the university, I thought was an interesting addition to our list. Many of the barriers, I think, will probably be unsurprising to you. Most said things like faculty time, faculty willingness, faculty concerns about quality. I think something we've heard a lot in these discussions. Some did say the bookstore, and Adam's going to talk a little bit more about the bookstore discussions in a minute. And our negative research university had a wonderful quote on this, which I think is interesting too. They said, "We as a research university want our faculty focused directly on their disciplines, scholarly engagement, discovery, and publication of their discoveries, and of course, teaching and curating the new knowledge they create. To have them focusing on creating new course materials as opposed to creating new knowledge that can be shared in a variety of ways, including with course materials, would take their time and attention from their fundamental work, and I would not want to do that. Another thing I really didn't anticipate, the idea that the creation of course materials, and I think by extension maybe even the process to adopt them for classes or anything else, would be taking faculty time and attention away from the actual creation of new knowledge, and that would in itself be an objection to a program like this. So another one to add to the list, which was unanticipated. And the last two questions we asked, first was if these VPFAs would be willing to pursue a different tuition formula that would support a program like this, and what evidence would be required to justify that kind of change. Most said they would consider it, but other questioned if it would be a priority for the institution. Again, the idea of how this would be prioritized against other programs. And one said, as the chief business officer of this institution, and knowing the priorities and things we're not able to do right now, particularly with compensation, I'd be hard-pressed to say we need to take tuition dollars and do this versus providing the compensation we need on this campus for the faculty. And this was interesting because I know my own institution is going through the same faculty compensation wrangling. And at the end of the day, the money needed for that and the money needed for an OER program are probably pretty different. But the idea that we need to be approaching this with the idea of how to prioritize it with other programs, and what is the most important thing going on to campus right now, I thought was helpful. And the evidence really was demonstrable cost savings for students, which we heard multiple times. So how, if something like this was a different tuition formula was to be considered, how could we really demonstrate we have cost savings for students? And the last question is how they could envision universities securing funds. And we didn't hear a lot of other options for this. Really for this, public schools, if there are state programs that could possibly fund this, and there are a number of those in existence, or potentially a donor. So those are the only additional funding methods that we found. And then we had our secret extra question, which Adam's going to discuss now.
So every time we internally to the library world talk about OER, I think there's always a sense of wonderment about the extent of the impact or the relationship with the bookstore. And so we purposely did not ask our participants about the bookstore unless they chose not to volunteer information about the bookstore during our other questions, particularly about potential barriers. And so if the respondent did not bring up the bookstore as a potential barrier to an OER program, then we had a follow-up question asking if they saw bookstore revenue and an impact on bookstore revenue as a reason not to afford a textbook affordability program like an OER program. What we found was very interesting, and again, we're going to be doing further analysis and actually computing some statistical significance to see if this does exist. But our overall observation is that there tends to be a little bit of a split between the institutions that have a contract with an external vendor for their bookstore versus an institution where the institution has homegrown their bookstore. They own and operate their bookstore. And on the surface, the responses tend to actually be counterintuitive. The institutions that have homegrown their bookstore and own and operate their bookstore tend to view their bookstore as a service that's offered to students. They don't expect it to break even, or they expect it to break even, but they don't expect it to be a source of revenue. And they were very open and frank about the concept that of the revenue that the bookstore generates, which is small in comparison to the total bucket that the university operates with, the vast majority of it, the more than 50% of the revenue, tended to come from apparel and other sales rather than from textbook sales. So the institutions with a homegrown bookstore were much less concerned about impact on revenue than were institutions where they had a contract with Barnes & Noble or Follett, for example, where we actually had a quote from my VPFA, where we have a contract with Follett. The biggest barrier is if I'm not selling textbooks and we're not renting textbooks, then I'm not getting the 10% commission from Follett, which is well over $1 million a year that we use for unrestricted needs on campus. And so usually the contracts that exist for third-party vendors operating our bookstores have provisions for the vendor to provide some form of money back to the institution. That in some cases that's a guaranteed lump sum, in other cases it's a commission, but usually it tends to be unrestricted money that for most respondents indicated would typically go for student financial aid, but it didn't have to. It was unrestricted. They could use it for whatever they wanted to. And so the concept of the bookstore as a competitor to an OER program is not completely downplayed by this finding, but it is an interesting difference to note between different types of institutions. So finally, our next steps. We will be, hopefully, if we can get them scheduled, completing our interviews. Any feedback that we receive from you on our coding structure, we'll incorporate that into the coding structure we already have in place. Once we complete the interviews and have our coding structure finalized, we will begin coding the interview transcripts. And from there, we'll be able to take those codes and start to apply some statistical analysis methodologies to them. And then we'll be able to write up the results of that. And based on those findings, based on the themes that we're observing from these interviews, we're hoping to put together a survey that will be distributed much more widely to hopefully all the VPFAs within the United States so that we get an even bigger picture of their perceptions on this program. That concludes our presentation. Are there any questions or feedback for us? And we have provided also, we have the coding structure printed out up here as a handout. We also have a link to that coding structure draft if you want to take a look at it later and shoot us some thoughts or feedback. And likewise, if you have questions you would like to see us or have us consider putting into the national level survey, feel free to send those our way as well. Sure, I think it really has varied fairly widely. I mean, we have the one institution that Zan mentioned that was very anti-OER. I think most of the VPFAs kind of fall into a bemused state of we didn't know about this. So it's kind of interesting. I'm glad that I know about it. I'll kind of tuck it away for future reference. And then there was one, I think in Oregon actually, where the state has started to put together some requirements around it, where he was very familiar with it, and the institution was very active in trying to figure out textbook affordability issues. And so he was wildly enthusiastic about the library being a possible major assistant in helping to figure out this problem. Is that a fair summary?
No. Oh, hi. And I'd say the other piece of that is that we really had a hard time getting them to agree to an interview. So this is a part of, a lot of them were unclear what their role in this was. And they were trying to send us to the library or often trying to send us to the bookstore because I think often they didn't know enough about the topic to feel comfortable speaking to it, and that made them nervous. I think really, they didn't want to go into an interview without feeling comfortable in the topic. So I think that pretty much falls into the bemused category as well. They didn't know enough about it, and so then we're concerned about trying to say anything. Yeah, that's actually what we did as a preview for each of the schools. So in contacting the school, we'd also contact the library and say two things. First, we are going to talk to your BPFA, just so you know. And second, do you have an OER program? We sort of creeped their websites first to try to figure it out, which is surprisingly easy, actually. There's not a lot of keywords, and you can figure it out pretty fast. But we also asked the library, the dean of the library. And we heard back from, I'd say, about a little over half were pretty responsive. And we didn't want to go into something, if they had statewide OER programs already, we didn't seem like this would be very helpful to figure out, we wanted schools that did not have a program in place.
There we go. Okay. So I think something that was surprising for us is just the extent to which there was just really very little awareness of this at all. And I know from my own conversations with previous provosts, having had a couple at this point, that really they had just the barest surface level understanding, if they had even heard of OER at all. Library deans, most deans are not necessarily encouraged to work directly with the VPFA without involving the provost. So I think something that is useful to keep in mind is that you need to do some education of the chief academic officer as well in order to start to build that foundation with the VPFA. But I really think that, the big finding of this is going to be that any effort to pitch an OER program is going to have to assume zero knowledge of the topic before you actually start to pitch it.
I was just going to say, again, there's a lot more third-party programs out there, and I think that market seems to be moving very quickly in terms of what's in. I found in my own institution, these things are being pitched to a lot of other places on campus that are not the library, and so I think that's going to really change this as well. You may find that they have heard of this, but because it's been pitched to them through some completely other channel. So we'll see how that works.
That's a great suggestion. While we haven't really started talking about the survey content yet, one thing that I tend to include when I do large-scale studies like this is an option for the respondent to include their email address if they'd like to kind of receive the results of the study, a précis of it, and so I think that would be a really good method to be able to distribute some educational materials about it.